Hello. First of all, I want to thank my patrons on Subscribestar and those on PayPal as well. I picked up quite a few more patrons and I do thank you all for joining up. It's very useful. Thank you all. And I wanted to remind you I'm now selling T-shirts and mugs. So, description, tell you where to get them. This channel isn't monetized because I don't want to be tempted by pandering, by worrying about losing money if I say something that is going to offend people. So I'm just staying away from that temptation. But of course it means that I rely more heavily on other sources of income than what YouTube would be prepared to give me. Right, so I'm going to start with this article in The Guardian by Rupert Jones. Another Jones. Do all Guardian journalists have to be called Jones? Anyway, I'm going to talk about the things Mr. Jones does not talk about in his complaint about rapacious landlords and careless council planning departments. But first, let's talk about Mrs. Vizard. You haven't heard of her? Well, some of you might have. Mrs. Vizard was the creation of a novelist called Norman Collins. He's no Dostoevsky by any means, but a very competent writer and one who came up with a very striking portrait of London life just before World War II. George Orwell did something similar in a book called Down and Out in Paris and London, but in his case, I think Collins caught more of the atmosphere of London at that time than Orwell did, in a more engaging way. It's, for sure. Mrs. Vizard owned a little terraced house in London. To be exact, number 10, Dulcimer Street in Kennington. And she rented out rooms to various people. And the time I'm talking about is around 1938, with the Second World War looming like a black sun over the horizon. And you may ask why I have decided to talk about a bunch of lower middle class people hanging on to respectability by their fingernails in a seedy and grimy part of London just before Armageddon struck. Oh, by the way, Kennington was particularly badly hit during the Blitz. The Blitz was the German carpet bombing during the early part of the war, which was intended to bring Britain to its knees. So it's possible that Mrs. Vizard and her house, or rather the real life people represented by those characters, were nothing but a heap of rubble within a few months after the end of the novel. Anyway, back to business. London Belongs to Me was a book about the inmates of a rooming house in pre-war London and the threadbare, dusty lives they had to live. Interestingly, and here I am really heading off at a tangent, that life persisted into a few years after the Second World War as well, with little old ladies renting off the rooms in their houses. And they did that because they were born at the end of the 19th century. They weren't trained for any profession because at that time middle-class women were trained only to be wives and mothers. And then when the First World War stole their husbands, their sweethearts, and their brothers, indeed, they had nothing to support them. When their parents died, these ladies had absolutely no other source of income but the family house. In many cases then, they lived their barren lives out in the kitchen and the front parlour of their property, and they rented out all the bedrooms to get themselves some sort of income. And this was reflected in another film called The Lady Killers, starring Alec Guinness and Peter Sellers. And it is, by the way, one of the funniest films ever made. And if you get to see it, please. And I'm not talking about the recent American version, which was a mess and completely missed the point of the original. Anyway, the character of Professor Marcus, which Alec Guinness was playing in The Lady Killers, was that of a con man who found accommodation in a dilapidated rooming house. And apparently, when creating the characterisation, Guinness used as his model another character played by another famous actor, Alistair Sim, in his characterisation of Mr. Squales, a smooth con man who takes up residence at Mrs. Vizard's place in number 10 Dulcimer Street. So you see, I did get back there in the end. Guinness actually did such a good job of channeling Alistair Sim that Alistair Sim records that people kept congratulating him on the good job he'd done in The Lady Killers. He said he didn't mind Guinness copying him in that way. He just wished he could have had some of the royalties. Well, anyway, back to Rupert Jones. This is Alexandra House, which was thrown up in total disregard for architectural unity, symmetry, or any sort of elegance, when in the 1960s, Haringey Council decided to bulldoze the charming, if somewhat chaotic, Victorian suburb of Wood Green in their quest for a brave new world or something. Anyway, the building is now no longer fit for use as offices, and Haringey want to sell it off, which apparently they would like to do to a developer who wants to turn it into 219 flats. So here we have Jones's complaint about capitalism. The billionaire and the 219 tiny flats. A new low for Rabbit Hutch Britain? Campaigners have piled in to criticise plans drawn up by a billionaire property tycoon to cram more than 200 tiny flats into an office building in North London. They describe it as a human warehouse that would be filled with people living in cramped, single-occupancy shoeboxes like rabbits in hutches, amid claims that some of the planned flats would be as small as 15 square metres, which is less than 13 feet by 13 feet to you guys across the Atlantic. For residents' entire living space, some locals say the proposal is one of the most shocking examples yet of the phenomenon known as office to residential conversion. A typical Premier Inn hotel room is 21 square metres, so that's even smaller than a Premier Inn room. I suppose that includes the Premier Inn bathroom as well. So what we have here is basically a large bedroom with, I should imagine, a shower and WC on one side and some sort of kitchen arrangement on the other, and that's it. And this is considered a terrible thing. And yet at no point in this article is the writer talking about why this should be happening and what could possibly go wrong. He just talks about the lack of space. But for a single person, well, it's not roomy, but it is accommodation, and it's in a part of the world where rents are really super high and space is restricted. And it just so happens in this case, the building's right next to Wood Green tube station and many, many bus routes, as well as all the Wood Green shops. So I can well imagine there'll be people queuing up for these little rooms. I'll also say that provided there's enough light and air, it doesn't really matter that the rooms are small, if that's all you can afford. And in a crowded place like that part of London, that's all most office workers could afford. So the first thing I thought about was that there's been so much immigration into London that it must be much more crowded now than it ever was. And That's why we have people like Rupert Jones complaining that people are being packed into tiny rooms. But actually, no. Haringey had more residents in 1938 than it has now. This is the figure for 1931. Just look, 297,936, which is as near as damn it to 298,000 people, as opposed to 254,926 in 2011. I believe that the figures for 2018 are more like 284,000, but that's still not as many as the nearly 298,000 in 1931. So, seeing as there were no office to residential conversions then, no rabbit hutch houses in London at the time, where did all the people live? Well, back to Dulcimer Street. They lived in rooming houses, and they were cramped cheek by jowl in ways that make the Alexandra House flatlets look like positive palaces. Whole families lived in bedrooms with no proper sanitary facilities, perhaps a sink in the bedroom if they were lucky, but nothing else. Cooking meals over a Primus stove, queuing up for the one toilet which was probably an outhouse at the bottom of the garden, taking weekly turns for use of the single bath. Mrs. Vizard's place at 10 Dulcimer Street, so far as I remember, had one room occupied by a mother and son, another room occupied by a married couple and their adult daughter. I have the book somewhere, but I couldn't find it, so I'm not entirely sure. And Mr. Squales, the con man, the fake medium and the con artist psychic, as well as Mrs. Vizard herself, of course. And that's how lower middle-class London lived. Dressing respectably, going to work in the morning and coming back in the evening to their crowded rooms in their crowded houses. Sorry, I'm going to take my shoes off. So these buildings here, where you have basically a hotel bedroom with ensuite bath and kitchen facilities, and I hope fulfilling all the legal requirements for light and air. Well, it's not exactly Sandringham, but it's not bad. And quite reasonable if you have this much population. So why would Jones consider this a problem? Well, my thought is that it's what he's not talking about. And what he's not talking about is the composition of the people who will be living in this building here. That's the problem. Because you see, the people who lived at Mrs. Vizard's all had the same expectations of each other, even the con man. They were not only from a common social strata, but also from a common cultural background. And I know that some of the people who watch my videos think in terms of ethnic backgrounds. I'm not saying it's totally irrelevant, but in my opinion, it isn't as important as cultural background. How somebody behaves in company is more important than what they look like. Well, that's just my opinion. So back to the residents of number 10 Dulcimer Street. The people there quite literally all spoke the same language and had the same expectations. I'll give you an example of expectations. If you help an old lady across the road here in the UK, you're being generous and polite. But if you tried the same thing in Morocco, say, not only would the old lady take offence because she would take it that you're implying she's old and incompetent, but also you would have contravened a social convention by holding her arm. So a lack of social expectations or a clash of social expectations are a serious problem if you're living in a very close environment. My husband likes curries, for instance. If we cooked curries every day and lived in the next room to someone who really couldn't stand the smell of garlic, then that person would suffer. And sooner or later, the friction created would cause trouble. Perhaps not specifically about the curry, but something else would erupt. And it's not just a matter of curries. For instance, if you're Spanish and you're accustomed to living a lot of your life after 10 o'clock at night, then the neighbour next door who has to get up at 6 in the morning is going to be quite unhappy with you. Whereas if you were living in Spain and everyone kept to that sort of a schedule, it wouldn't matter. So when you have people of different cultural backgrounds and living in as crowded an accommodation as this one will be, you're going to have some serious social problems. And this is where the problem is. It's not the small rooms. People got along reasonably in far less well-appointed situations than that in pre-war London. The problem is the demographics, where there are different groups of people, each with differing lists of social expectations of each other. So what Rupert Jones should be talking about is how we school people into behaving according to a common rule. You know, keeping quiet in the corridors, not shouting loudly, not loud radios in foreign languages, which is incredibly irritating, that sort of thing. In other words, there have to be rules to make us less, not more, diverse. And how do we do that? Well, we have laws. We should apply them equally and to all. And Mr. Jones is not talking about that, because that is another story, isn't it? He's not going to insist that the law be applied equally to all. So all he can think of is there should be more space between people. Well, that's not going to happen in the London of today. So people have to face these problems and actually start talking about them. If you want to donate or contact, the information will be rolling over the Graniopteryx as I speak. Please like, subscribe and share, because it does help with the algorithm. If you visit my channel on YouTube and one day discover that I've disappeared without warning, you'll still find me on BitChute or Minds. Just go to either of those platforms and do a search for Graniopteryx. If you're already watching this on BitChute or Minds, good for you. Meanwhile, if you're watching this on YouTube, remember that you must keep checking the subscribe and bell icons, because occasionally they reset. Till next time.